Alright, we're going to begin our exploration of the Colle and Torre systems that white could play after the moves d4, d5, knight f3, and if black plays knight f6, he might go e3. Now, you guys are probably all very familiar with the Rogozin after c4, e6, the queen's gambit, but the Colle and Torre system is actually very popular because it's easy to play for white. The idea for white here is to play the move e4. Okay, well that's weird, right? Why did he play e3 if he's going to play the move e4 in the future? Well, the idea is that e4 actually creates a lot of space for white, and if white really wants to try to play e4 right now, the problem is that black actually has two pieces controlling it right now. So where's white going to find two defenders of e4? Like, he can have a knight, but what else? So he really needs to play e3 to get out his bishop, and then he can play e4 later on in the future. Now, usually the Colle system is characterized by the moves e3, followed by bishop d3, and then knight d2, and then queen e2, or after castle and rook e1, and then finally e4. But the idea that I'll give you guys is to try to play your own e5 before he gets a chance to play e4. I think that equalizes quite quickly. Now, if black plays e6, white can play bishop d3, and now black should directly strike at the center with the move c5. Now, a lot of times, I find in most games I see, white will play the move c3. c3, the idea is that if takes, white can take back with his own c-pawn instead of taking with the e-pawn. However, it's worth mentioning that there's another line that's b3, and b3 is actually quite common too. b3, black can simply just play knight to c6. After castling, you can develop your bishop to d6, and for example, bishop b2, castle, and if white, this is white's usual development scheme, knight b to d2, and then he's going to try to play e4. Black can simply just play queen to c7, and if after c4, you can just simply trade on d4 and play b6. Position here is quite good for black, I think. Development is quite natural. For example, if rook to c1, it's very simple just to play bishop b7. White does get good spots for his rook, but for example, just rook to c8. And if white tries to play something like knight to e5, we can simply shift our queen to e7. We will use the c file later on for our attack. What's black's idea here in the middle game? Black's idea is to play rook to d8 and attack the d4 pawn and c4 pawn. These two pawns do look very strong, and they do have gain a lot of space for white, but they can be weak, especially when you have major pieces lined up against them on these half-open files. But back to what I think you guys will see the most is the move c3. The idea is c3 supports this d4 pawn, so we have e4 in the future. This is the line that white players usually choose to play, and I suggest against this move, knight b to d7. Well, you guys might be wondering, we went to c6 last time, why do we go to d7 this time? We go to d7 this time because we want to put our knight onto f6 in case this knight gets traded away. Let me illustrate something. For example, if knight to d2, and we play bishop d6, if white decides to play e4 immediately, then we can simply trade, and trade everything here, and we have a knight to go to f6 to replace that knight that we just traded off, winning a tempo against this undefended bishop on e4. When he plays bishop to d3, we can simply just castle. This position is completely fine for black. For example, after castling, I can show you a little bit more. If white castles, then black can simply play b6. White's bishop may go to g5. Black can put his bishop on b7. I think this is a really balanced position. Later on, maybe queen c2, h6. If bishop h4, that's fine. This knight might be a problem later on for white, but I think black's development should be still fine. For queen e7, rook c8, rook d8 should be a nice position for black to play. Going back, therefore, white sometimes doesn't want to open up the center so quickly, and he will castle. But if he does castle, then this is the first time that black has the opportunity to play his own e5. And if you look in the opening book, this might not be the most popular move. In fact, if we look here, not many people play it. However, you can see that it has a surprising number of visits, because this line is actually very, very good, I think. You equalize very quickly here. White doesn't really have much of a choice. He has to take on e5, otherwise you play the move e4. If he plays e4 himself, then you can castle. If he trades off with you here, and plays f4, you can come back to c7. And if he plays e5, then you can go to the move knight to g4, threatening the fork on e3. If he plays knight to f3, then you can solve the problem of the e5 pawn by playing f6 while it's still weak. And if h3, a good idea here is to play the great move f takes e5. If f takes e5, if he takes here, then we have the e4 push. It's a fork, winning the piece back. And black has definitely equalized there as well. Many times, though, black might choose to take on d takes e5. If d takes e5, then we will take back with the knight. We don't want to give the opponent the pair of bishops. After knight takes, then we can take back with the bishop. And, okay, he has the same trick we do, right? He can play knight f3 and gain a tempo on our bishop. But the difference here is that, look at his bishop. This bishop still can't come out. Meanwhile, both of our bishops here have nice long diagonals to use. After, for example, h3 to stop bishop g4, black can simply just castle. If you play, for example, queen to e2 to try to play e4, rook to e8 simply stops out any ideas of that. It's worth mentioning that instead of knight takes e5, there's an idea of playing bishop to b5 here. But trading the light square bishop doesn't really give white any sort of advantage. For example, after bishop d7, bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, and a similar position arises. Right, white does get this open file here. The queen does put pressure on the d5 pawn, but I think this position is actually even worse than the one before, because after bishop c7, let's remove this arrow. After bishop c7 here, look at how this bishop is hemmed in by these pawns, right? This pawn, these are all on dark squares. Meanwhile, the light square bishop was a good bishop in white's position because it had all these nice diagonals. In this case, sure, black doesn't have the pair of bishops anymore, but I think white is just left with his terrible bishop, and that's not really good for him at all either. So I think our general idea in the Colle is we don't want to let him play e4, but if he does, we have the knight d7 to f6 idea, which gives us a nice open position that's easy to play. Usually in this kind of system, both bishops have nice developing opportunities. Both bishops are able to get nice diagonals. But also, if he plays c3, if he lets us, then I think it's also a good idea to play knight d7, and immediately after knight d2, bishop d6 castling, I think when we have the chance, it's a good idea to play the move e5. If he plays the move b3, then he is probably not likely to play the move e4 anymore, because then we will take his pawn on d4, and his e4 pawn will look quite awkward. In fact, he will have no central pawns left, and that's not good for him. So in this case, then, if he's not going to play e4, we can play knight to c6, and develop similarly to the regular Queen's Gambit system. After castling, we can play our normal bishop d6, followed by castle, and bishop b7, get a rooks on c8, and this should also lead to a fairly normal position that should be easy to play as well. And now we have a side note on the Colle system. The Torre system here is when white chooses to play the move bishop to g5 instead of playing e3 first and blocking his bishop in. After bishop to g5, black can simply develop normally as well. He can go and play the move e6. White will play the move e3, and then black can move c5 as well. Now, if white plays c4, then we have something similar to a Queen's Gambit. So I will not go into that line here. We will look at the line knight b to d2. Black plays bishop to e7, and now white plays the move c3. Now here, black still develops normally, playing knight b to d7. We play the knight to d7 to guard the f6 knight, so that when the bishop takes, we can recapture with the knight and still control the square e4. After knight to d7, white plays bishop to d3. He wants to put more pressure on the e4 square as well, so he can play something like queen to c2 or queen to e2 in the future and then push e4. However, black will play the move b6 to develop his bishop to b7, where it also will put pressure on the e4 square. Seeing that his e4 plan will probably not be working out anytime soon, white will play the move knight to e5 to attack the square on c6. If white plays knight to e5, black can simply play bishop to b7 and take control of that square on c6. If white delays knight to e5 by castling, then black, this is a similar move order, bishop e7, knight to e5, and now black should trade on e5. If d takes e5, then knight to d7, forcing the trade of the dark square bishops after this, and white will probably play f4. If white plays f4, black can simply castle. So white will probably have some sort of kingside attack here. Black really has no pieces right now defending the king, but white doesn't really have any pieces to attack the king either. For example, if white tries something like queen to h5, black can simply play something like even f5. And if white chooses to take the on f6, then black can come back with knight takes f6. And he guards the h7 pawn. I mean, here black can also choose to play something like g6 and eventually shift the knight to f8, where it guards these squares as well. So I don't think black's king is going to be in danger in this situation. And with this position, black can either try something in the center with d4 later on in the future, or he can attack the queen side with something like c4, followed by b5 and b4. Going back here, if white chooses to not play the move knight to e5, he may try something like queen to b1, and the idea is to put pressure on the h7 square. So we move the pawn away from h7, play h6, he goes bishop to h4, and now we can castle anyway. White might try to start something on the queen side and play b4 to lock things up, but then after c4, your position should be fine. For example, bishop to c2. Later on, black in fact can strive for something like e5. So if we go back to the beginning of here, the Torre attack is after bishop g5, and white gets his dark square bishop outside the pawn chain so that he will not have it hemmed in after e3. But the downside to this is that he must find other ways to play than finding the e4 break. And given black the time, black can develop pretty easily and control e4 very well.